Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the channel. Before we slip into tonight's story, I'd like to take just a quiet moment to ask you something. When you come here, when you settle in, and let the words and the quiet sounds wash over you, how does it feel? Does the weight of the day begin to soften? Do the thoughts that spin slowly start to still? I truly hope so. That is the only purpose of this peaceful space. If these stories help you find rest, I would love to know. Leave a little word in the comments below. Just yes, or calm, or even an emoji, to let me know you're here, finding a moment of peace. It means so much. And if this is your haven for rest, consider subscribing to the channel. A gentle tap on that button helps this quiet corner grow, and it tells YouTube to bring these stories to others who need a soft place to land. But for now, let all of that drift away. Just let it go. It's time to set everything down. And join me in a small quiet shop on a cobbled lane for the story of the Unhurried Clockmaker. The quiet here is not an absence of sound, but a presence. It is a soft, dense thing like felt. It fills the small shop from the floorboards, worn smooth and pale by generations of slow footsteps, to the exposed beams of the ceiling, where shadows pool in the grain of the wood like still, dark water. The air moves, but so slowly you would miss it if you tried to see it. It moves only when the breath of the man at the workbench stirs it, or when a single mote of dust, after hours of drifting, decides to settle. He is here, as he always is, Mr. Hemsley. To call him old would be to misunderstand time. He is simply of this place, as the wood is of the bench, as the glass is of the window. His hands rest on the leather pad before him, palms down, fingers slightly curled. They are not idle, but resting between acts of care. The skin is crisscrossed with fine lines, a map of a lifetime spent in gentle, precise motions. A silver smudge, the permanent signature of his craft, marks the side of his right thumb. Before him, on the workbench of honey-colored pine, lies the day's companion. It is not a task, but a presence. A carriage clock, with a case of rosewood so dark it appears black until the light from the window finds it, and then it glows with a deep reddish heart. Its glass face is clean, but behind it, the brass hands are still. They point to no hour, for its inner world is at peace. It is a patient object. It does not mind the stillness. Mr. Hemsley's gaze rests upon it. He does not look at it so much as he receives it. He notes the way a particular knot in the rosewood grain spirals like a tiny frozen galaxy just below the winding T. He sees the single, almost imperceptible hairline fracture in the lower left corner of the glass, a flaw accepted and loved long ago. His eyes are a pale, watery blue, the color of a winter sky just after dawn. They hold no urgency, only a soft open attention. His breath is the quietest rhythm in the room, in and out, a slow, soft sigh of air entering, pause, where everything seems to suspend. Then, the gentlest release, as the air leaves him, warmed by his body, to join the still atmosphere of the shop. In and out, from the corner of the room comes another rhythm, deeper, older. The long case clock, its pendulum, a burnished disc of brass, swings behind a little glass door. It does not tick and talk in a sharp, mechanical way. Its sound is a soft, woody thok. And then, a moment later, another thok, as if the sound itself is tired and must rest between effort. It is not marking time. Mine? It is simply breathing for the room. A decision forms, not as a thought, but as a shift in weight. Mr. Hensley leans forward. An inch? Perhaps two. His woolen sweater, a cable knit of undyed sheep's wool, whispers a single, soft sound against the stool. His elbows settle more fully into the depressions on the leather pad. These depressions are perfect molds, created over decades for his elbows alone. It is a perfect fit. His right hand begins to move. It lifts from the bench. The muscles of the forearm engage, but so subtly that the fabric of his sleeve barely stirs. The hand rises, turning slowly in the air, so the palm faces downward. The fingers loose. It travels across the space above the tools, not towards them, but towards a clean white cloth folded neatly to the side. The cloth is linen, woven from flax on a loom that has long since fallen. It was bleached not by harsh chemicals, but by sunlight on a meadow years ago. His fingertips brush the cloth. The linen is not soft like cotton. It has a dry, fibrous texture, a slight resistance. It feels honest. His fingers gather a fold of it, pinching it gently between thumb and forefinger. He draws it towards him. Pulling, the cloth unfolds itself without sound. A slow-motion blossom of white spreading across the dark grain of the pine. He smooths it with the flat of his hand. Well, not to remove wrinkles, but to feel its expanse. The action is repeated once, twice. The sound is a soft, dry whisper, like pages turning in an ancient book. Now, with the field prepared, he turns his attention to the first tool. Not the clock yet. The clock will come. First, the intermediary, a screwdriver. Not the smallest, but a medium one, with a handle of boxwood, polished to a warm, buttery gleam. He reaches for it. Now, his fingers do not close around it immediately. They hover above the tray, then descend to encircle the handle. The grip is not tight. It is an embrace. The wood, always kept in this room, is the exact temperature of the air. It feels like nothing at first. And then, slowly, it communicates a solid, reassuring warmth. The latent memory of every hand that has ever held it. He lifts the screwdriver. It weighs almost nothing, and yet its purpose gives it a profound gravity. He holds it up not to inspect it, but to allow the light to acknowledge it. The steel shaft captures the dull gold of the afternoon and turns it into a thin, cool line of reflection. He turns it slowly, watching the line of light travel the length of the metal. There is a single microscopic fleck of something, not rust, perhaps a speck of old pine resin. Near the tip, he sees it. He acknowledges it with a slow blink. It is part of the tool's story. It will not interfere. No, don't. He lowers the screwdriver until it lies diagonally across the white cloth, its tip pointing toward the silent carriage clock. It is ready. Now, he brings both hands to the clock itself. They approach from either side, like quiet attendants. His palms do not touch the rosewood. His fingers slide beneath its base. The wood is cool, smooth, dense. He feels the precise weight of it, the heavy, dormant mechanics inside, the solidity of the case. He lifts it. It rises an inch, then two, from the bench. He translates it through the air, a distance of no more than a hand's breadth, and sets it down in the very center of the white linen cloth. The sound of wood meeting wood is a soft, solid knock, so muted it is felt more than heard. The clock is now centered. The ritual space is defined. He sits back. He looks at the clock on its white island. He breathes in and out. The long case clock in the corner marks the passage of this moment with its gentle thok, and then, later, its companion thok. The light from the window has imperceptibly shifted. The panel of gold on the floor has lengthened, stretching towards the legs of the workbench. The motes of dust within it drift on currents too slow to name, rising, falling, turning in a silent, weightless ballet. Mr. Hemsley's hand moves again, returning to the screwdriver. This time, his fingers find their specific places on the boxwood handle. That of his thumb rests on the rounded end. His index and middle fingers curl along the shaft. It is a grip of supreme control and utter relaxation. He brings the tip of the tool to the first of the 4 tiny screws that hold the brass backplate of the carriage clock to its wooden case. The tip finds the slot. It is a perfect fit. The width of the steel is the width of the slot. There's no play, no wiggle. Metal rests in metal with a sense of completeness. He begins to turn. His wrist rotates clockwise. The motion is so minimal, it is almost invisible. A quarter turn. I see Ellison. He pauses. Ali, the screw, seated for perhaps 50 years, acquiesces. The threads disengage with a faint, crystalline resistance that travels up the steel shaft, through the boxwood handle, into the bones of his hand. A tiny electric whisper of release. Another quarter turn. A pause. Another. Once. With each fractional movement, the screw rises by a height smaller than a grain of sand. He does not remove it yet. He simply loosens it, inviting it to remember that it can move. He repeats this process with the other 3 screws, moving clockwise around the plate. Each screw receives the same deliberate, respectful attention. A quarter turn. A pause for the universe to settle. Another quarter turn. There is no rush. The act of loosening is as important as the act of removal. When all 4 screws have been turned exactly 8 times each, though the number is irrelevant, only the feeling of completeness matters. He sets the screwdriver down, parallel to its original position on the cloth. He picks up a pair of tweezers. Their tips are so fine, they are nearly transparent. He inserts the very point into the slot of the first screw. He coaxes it upward. The screw, now willing, rises from its threaded hole. It hangs from the tips of the tweezers, a tiny, glittering artifact. He transfers it to a small, lidded dish of black ceramic, where it will wait without rolling. He does this for each screw. One by one, they are retired to the dish. The sound they make as they touch the ceramic is a series of faint, high-pitched tinks like distant wind chimes on a still day. Now the backplate is free. He uses the flat end of the tweezers to gently pry it up. There is a soft, sighing sound as the seal of age and faint, old adhesive gives way. He lifts the brass plate away. He sets it aside on the cloth. its inner surface facing up, revealing a perfect circular impression of the clock's heart. And there it is. The world within the world. The mechanism. Well, it is a universe of paused intention. Gears of varying sizes, each with teeth of mathematical perfection, interlock in a frozen dance. Springs coil in tight, silent spirals of potential energy, levers and pivots and arbors stand in perfect geometric relation. A faint smell emerges, not of oil or metal, but of clean, cold complexity. It is the scent of order itself. Mr. Hemsley does not dive in. He observes. He lets his eyes travel the pathways of the movement. He notes a tiny jewel, a ruby bearing, gleaming like a frozen drop of wine in the dim light. He sees the gentle curve of the mainspring through its barrel. All is still. All is perfect. There is no dirt here, only a fine protective layer of ancient dried oil, dusted with the ghost of time. His work is not repair, it is reverence. No, it is the simple act of witnessing this silent, intricate marvel. He picks up the finest of his brushes, one with bristles no thicker than a human hair. He dips just the very tips into a vial of clear, thin oil. The oil climbs the bristles by capillary action, a tiny amber bead forming. With a hand that does not tremble, he brings this bead to the pivot point of the first, largest gear. He lets the oil touch the junction of axle and bearing. It does not drip. It flows. It is drawn into the microscopic space by hunger, older than friction. It spreads, a minuscule, gleaming film, fulfilling a promise made when the clock was first assembled. He will do this for every pivot, every point of rotation. 47 points. 3. He knows without counting. The process will take what it takes. The light will change. The dust will dance. The long case clock will continue its soft wooden breathing. And in this shop, on this afternoon, time will not pass. It will pool. It will settle. It will become as deep and as still as a forgotten forest pond, where the only movement is the slow, gentle settling of leaves through water, spiraling down towards a soft, dark, and perfect peace. He begins with the largest gear, the one at the very heart of the stillness. It is the first to have received the tension of the spring, the first to have turned, and, in turning, set all the others into their measured, celestial dance. Now it is a disc of brass, silent and profound. Its teeth are not sharp. They are worn to soft, perfect curves by the gentle, endless friction of its neighbor. Each tooth is a hill and a valley, a topography of time past. Tip of the brush, bearing its microscopic globe of oil, approaches. It does not touch the metal immediately. It does not touch the metal immediately. It hovers a hair's breadth away. Mr. Hemsley's breath is held, not in suspense, but in deference. The droplet at the tip of the bristle swells, held back only by the tension of the oil itself, a perfect trembling sphere of potential relief. Then contact, the faintest, most gossamer touch. The bristle bends, just once, against the shoulder of the gear's axle. The oil does not splash or spread. It is received. The metal, thirsty in its stillness, draws the oil from the bristle like a root drawing moisture from deep, dark soil. The amber bead diminishes, vanishing into the narrow, invisible seam where the polished end of the axle meets the polished wall of its bearing. It is a kiss of liquidity, a return of something lost to the dryness of years. He withdraws the brush. The bristle springs back, clean, leaving no trace. The action is complete. He does not check it. He knows. He has seen the oil. Accept the invitation. He moves to the next pivot. It is the axle of a smaller gear, one that interlocked with the first. This gear has 32 teeth, each one a precise, incremental fraction of a circle. He knows this without counting. The number is felt in the spacing, in the rhythm of gold against gold when the clock was running. The oiling ritual is repeated. The hover, the breath held in the throat, a soft pause in the tide of air. The approach, so slow it is a growth rather than a movement. The touch, lighter than a thought. The transfer, a silent sip. The withdrawal, and so it goes. Pivot by pivot, a journey across a frozen galaxy. Each junction of metal is a star, and he is the gentle, patient force that ensures their light could, one day, turn again. He does not think of making it turn. He thinks only of the care required in this moment. The present need is simply oil. The present action is simply this touch. The light continues its slow, inevitable slide. The bright panel on the floor has climbed a leg of the workbench now, a slanted rectangle of gold warming the dark pine. The motes of dust within it are fewer. Or perhaps they have simply grown too tired to dance and have settled on the surfaces of things, adding another layer to the soft, gray felt of age that covers every undisturbed object in the room. His hands work. They are not his hands anymore. They are instruments of the ritual itself. They move with a quiet intelligence that bypasses thought. Lift the brush. Dip. A shallow immersion into the vial that produces the same perfect droplet every time. Over. Dotting. Salad. Tumblesword. Apply. Withdraw. Dotting. Set the brush down. Ideal place. It's up the old. A pause for one full breath. In and out. Observe the place where the oil has gone, seeing not the oil itself, but the faint, renewed sheen it leaves on the surrounding metal. A patina of readiness. The talk. From the corner is a metronome for this meditation. It does not pace him. It simply exists alongside his work, a companion in the marking of silent passage. Half the pivots are tended to. The vial of oil is half emptied, a clear liquid with a golden heart, sloshing silently with the tiny motions of his hand. He does not stop. There is no break, for there is no fatigue. There is only the next point of contact, the next tiny, dry joint waiting for the blessing of viscosity. He comes to the escapement. This is the soul of the clock, the part that took the steady power of the turning gears and broke it into the measured, beating steps of seconds. Well, it is a delicate cage of brass, holding within it the pallet fork and the escape wheel. These parts are finer, more delicate. Their pivots are smaller, their jewels tinier. His movements grow even more deliberate, if that were possible. The breath he holds is softer, shallower. The approach of the brush is a slow-motion falling leaf, drifting side to side on imperceptible air currents, until it lands with the weight of nothing. Here, the oil must be even more sparing. A droplet too large would gum the delicate action, would cling and resist where it must flow and facilitate. He coaxes the oil into the brush, then gently touches the bristles to the edge of a porcelain dish, leaving just a film behind. This film is what he brings to the ruby jewel of the palette fork, a transfer of sheen, of possibility. He works for a long time on the escapement. Each surface, each point of contact between the hard red jewel and the polished brass of the escape wheel's teeth is considered. He does not oil them all, only the necessary ones. He knows which ones by the way the light reflects off their edges, by a memory in his fingertips that predates memory itself. Finally, it is done. The entire movement, from the great barrel of the mainspring to the final tiny click of the ratchet, gleams with a soft, new-found humidity. It is not wet. Wait, it is prepared. It is a garden after a dew, not a rain. He sets the brush down. Its duty fulfilled. He picks up a fresh, dry cloth, smaller than the first, made of lint-free silk. He unfolds it. The sound is a crisp, quiet promise. He begins to gently, so gently, wipe the excess oil from the surfaces of the gears, from the tops of the bridges. He is not cleaning. He is polishing the care he has just given. The silk whispers over the brass, a sound like a distant breeze through dry grass, leaves behind a deeper, drier, more resonant shine. The metal loses its wet look and takes on the warm, mellow glow of a captured sunset. He polishes until no stray droplet remains, until the movement is perfectly dry to the eye, yet secretly alive with lubrication in its hidden places. Then, and only then, does he look up from the microcosm. His eyes find the window. The light is no longer golden. It has softened to a dusky lavender gray. The day is yielding outside, but in here, time remains in its pool. He blinks, slowly. His shoulders, which have been held in a posture of perfect, relaxed focus for hours, soften by a degree. A single deep breath fills his lungs, a breath that seems to draw in the quiet of the room itself, and he releases it in a long, soundless sigh. The carriage clock's inner world is ready. It lies there on its white linen, a universe of potential, waiting for its case to be closed, for its key to be turned, for its heart to be given permission to beat. But that is not for today. Today's work was the oiling. That is all. That is everything. He reaches for the brass backplate. He lifts it. He aligns it over the movement, the screw holes matching their partners with a symmetry that is deeply satisfying. He presses it down. Albeit, there is a soft, final snick as it seats itself back into its century-old bed. One by one, with the tweezers, he retrieves the 4 screws from the black ceramic dish. One by one, he lowers them into their holes. One by one, he takes up the screwdriver and turns them home. Not tight, just snug. Old, a quarter turn past firm. A feeling of closure, not of constraint. He sets the screwdriver down, parallel to its original place. He looks at the clock. Whole again. Silent. Still, but different now. It hums with a silent readiness. It has been seen. It has been cared for. His hands return to rest on the leather pad, palms down. The silver smudge on his thumb catches the last of the dusk light from the window. In the corner, the long case clock marks another moment. Talk. And then, a lifetime later, stop. The quiet settles back in, deeper now, filled with the completion of a simple, perfect task. It is a quiet that has weight and texture. It is the quiet of a job done, of hands at rest, of a universe of gears, sleeping, oiled and peaceful. In a case of dark rosewood on a bed of white linen, in a pool of timeless gray twilight, his gaze lingers on the reassembled clock, not with pride, but with a quiet acknowledgement. The ritual was complete. The space between the act and the next breath stretched out, vast and still. From a shelf below the workbench, he drew out a small hinged box of unfinished cedar. The wood was pale, its grain a pattern of gentle, rippled shadows. The hinges were simple pins of brass, and they moved without sound. Inside, nestled in a cavity lined with faded blue velvet, was a key. Not the winding key for the carriage clock, that lay separately, but a smaller, slimmer key. Its purpose was not to give life, but to facilitate rest. He lifted this key. It was cold, as metal that is rarely touched tends to be. He held it for a moment between thumb and forefinger, letting it absorb the warmth from his skin. It was a transfer of energy, a tiny act of communion between the living and the inanimate. With his other hand, he turned the carriage clock around, its face now towards him. On the back, beside the winding arbor, was a second, smaller hole, a keyhole for setting the time. Mundane, he inserted the slender key. The fit was exact. There was no grinding, no resistance, only a smooth slide of metal into a shaped void. He turned the key, not to move the hands, they were stiff from disuse, but to engage the setting mechanism. A faint internal click echoed from within the rosewood case, a sound felt in the bones of the hand more than heard by the ear. It was the sound of a tiny clutch engaging, of gears shifting their allegiance from the mainspring to the outside world. Now he could move the hands. Well, he took the minute hand between the pad of his thumb and the side of his index finger. It was a slender blade of blued steel, its tip a delicate arrow. He applied pressure, infinitesimally. At first, nothing. Then, a surrender. The hand began to move. It did not jump, but slid. It traveled around the porcelain dial, its path marked by the raised black Roman numerals. Seke, Tui, Afi. The motion was fluid, silent. He guided it with a touch so light it would not bruise a pedal. He moved it until it pointed to the 12, the hour hand, following its slower, dictated ratio, settled just to the right of the side. It was not a specific time. It was a neutral time. The time of balance. The classic position of the hands in an illustration, showing the clock's graceful face without declaring an hour. It was the clock's version of a restful pose. He turned the setting key back, releasing the clutch. Another soft, internal click. The mechanism was now locked, the hands fixed in their peaceful, upright stance. He withdrew the key and returned it to its velvet nest in the cedar box. The lid closed with a whisper of wood on wood. Next came the polishing cloth. Not silk this time, but a larger square of flannel, worn to a sublime softness. From a stoneware bottle, he poured a drop of oil onto the cloth. Not the clear, thin oil for pivots, but a thicker, lemon-scented oil for wood. The scent was not sharp, but a ghost of citrus, a memory of a sunnier climate now faded into a mere suggestion of cleanliness. He began to polish the rosewood case. His movements were broad, circular, and encompassing. The oil vanished into the wood, not staining it, but waking its color. The deep, blackish-red heart of the rosewood emerged, glowing as if lit from within. He polished the sides, the top, the beveled edges of the glass. He polished until the wood felt warm and alive under his hand, until it reflected the dimming light in soft, liquid pools. The clock now sat on its white linen, gleaming softly, its hands at peace, its wood radiant. It was an object of profound stillness and latent beauty, but the workbench was not yet clean. He lifted the clock, cradling it, and placed it carefully on a lower shelf to his right, where it would sit until tomorrow, or next week, whenever it was chosen for the next stage of attention. He turned back to the expanse of white linen. With both hands he gathered the four corners of the cloth, lifting them to form a pouch. He carried this pouch to a large woven basket by the door. He opened the pouch and shook it gently. The tiny, invisible particles of brass dust, dried oil, and pine resin that had settled during his work drifted down into the basket. No sound. No sound. He then folded the linen cloth, not with crisp origami precision, but with a series of soft, overlapping folds, until it was a small, dense bundle. This he placed in a different basket, one for cloths that would be laundered in silent, soapy water and dried in the open country air. The workbench was bare again, save for the tools in their tray. One by one, he cleaned them. The screwdriver's shaft was wiped with a dry corner of the flannel cloth, removing the last molecular trace of oil from its tip. The tweezers were polished until their fine points gleamed like needles of ice. The brushes were stroked against a clean palm, aligning their bristles, before being returned to their porcelain cup, handles down, bristles up like a silent bouquet of tools. Finally, he attended to the leather pad where his elbows rested. He smoothed it with his hand, feeling the depressions his own body had made. He brushed off a single, stray fleck of lint. He aligned it so its edge was parallel to the edge of the workbench. Then he stopped. His hands returned to his lap. He sat on the stool in the gathering dusk. The lavender-gray light had deepened to a velvety blue. Datas in the corners of the shop were softening, blending into shadow. The long-case clock's face was a pale floating disk in the gloom, its hands now invisible. He sat. He breathed. The day's purpose, the careful, methodical act of tending to one silent object, was fulfilled. There was no next task. There was only this moment of existing within the completed circle of the day's intention. The shop was not dark, but full of a soft, blue darkness. It was a comforting darkness, like the space under a heavy blanket. The familiar shapes of the lathe, the shelves of clock faces, the rows of pendulum bobs, all became soft, rounded silhouette. They were old friends, resting. He did not light a lamp. The darkness was not an enemy to be banished, but a natural conclusion to be welcomed. It was the other side of the golden afternoon light. It was the shop's way of closing its eyes. A time that could have been 5 minutes or an hour. He stirred, not with a start, but with a gradual, tectonic shift of awareness. His feet found the floor. He stood. The stool made no sound as he pushed it gently under the bench, its legs settling into 4 faint dents in the wood floor. He walked to the door, his footsteps silent on the worn board. His hand found the heavy iron latch. He lifted it. mechanism inside the door released with a solid thunk that seemed enormously loud in the quiet, yet was deeply reassuring. He pulled the door open. A cool, night-scented breeze drifted in, carrying the smell of damp cobblestones and distant earth. It was fresh, but it did not disturb the settled quiet of the shop. It merely brushed against it. He stepped out onto the lane. He turned, and with one last look into the dark, peaceful belly of the room that was his world, he pulled the door closed. The sound was a soft, final shoom of wood meeting frame. The iron key from his pocket, the one for the door, was turned in the lock. A single, definitive clack echoed into the night. Then, silence. A deeper silence now, absolute and complete. Inside the shop, the darkness was total. The long case clock's pendulum had long since stilled. Its weights fully descended. The carriage clock sat on its shelf, a dark, gleaming pupil in the night. The tools slept in their tray. The motes of dust had all settled. There was only the memory of the day's care hanging in the air, a scent of lemon oil and quietness, slowly cooling, merging with the eternal patient stillness of things that wait, without anxiety for the return of the light and then its gentle, purposeful touch. The silence after the lock turned was not empty. It was a held breath. The shop existed now in a state of perfect suspension, a world preserved under a glass bell of night. The cool air from the lane that had slipped in with his exit slowly stilled. Its energy spent, the temperature began to equalize. The lingering daytime warmth of the pine workbench radiating gently into the center of the room, meeting the cooler air that clung to the stone floor near the door. In the absolute dark, other senses whispered. The scent of the lemon oil from the carriage clock's case was the most present, a clean, sharp note that gradually softened, becoming a mere idea of citrus. Beneath it, the older foundational smells reasserted themselves. The sweet, resinous odor of the pine workbench, the dry, papery smell of wood dust caught in the joints of the floorboards, the faint, metallic whisper of iron and brass. It was the smell of time asleep. Sound, so faint it was on the edge of perception, began. It was not a sound from within, but from without. The ancient timbers of the building, released from the subtle pressures of the day's warmth, now cooling in the night, began to talk in their sleep. A soft creak came from a beam above the long case clock. It was not a groan of strain, but a sigh of relaxation. A moment later, from the far wall near the shelves of spare parts, a tiny pop echoed, like a single grain of rice bursting. It was the sound of wood fibers adjusting minutely to the change, settling into a new, more comfortable arrangement for the dark hours. On the shelf, the polished carriage clock was a deeper pool of shadow. The rosewood, still warm from the oil and the friction of the cloth, released its fragrance in slow, invisible wave. The blued steel hands, fixed at their neutral position, held no light. But if a single star's beam had found its way through the window, it would have traced a silver line along their edges. Inside its case, the newly oiled movement did nothing. It simply rested. But the oil was at work on a microscopic level. It seeped by the forces of gravity and surface tension into even tighter crevices. It coated surfaces that had been merely brushed during the conscious, careful application. It was performing its final patient duty without witness. The dust, which had danced so bravely in the afternoon sun, now lay completely at rest. It formed a perfect, unbroken layer of gray, on every horizontal surface that had not been touched that day. The top of the lathe, the flat crown of a forgotten marble column clock, the seat of the second unused stool in a corner. It was a soft, felty blanket of inertia. Time, in the human sense, did not exist here now. The long case clock's weights were at the very bottom of their run. Its great pendulum was still, a vertical line of brass in the dark. The carriage clock's hands were frozen at 12 and 6. The dozens of other timepieces, in various states of assembly or disassembly on shelves and in drawers, were all silent. Their internal worlds paused. Yet, time in a different sense was palpable. It was the time of geology, of slow cooling, of imperceptible settlement. It was the time it takes for a scent to fade from a sharp note to a memory. It was the time it takes for warmth to surrender, molecule by molecule, to the coolness of a stone floor. Outside, the world of life and haste continued. Somewhere, a cot might have rattled on a distant road. An owl might have called from the woods beyond the lane. But the thick ancient glass of the window and the solid oak of the door muffled these events into nothingness. They were rumors from another universe. Inside, the universe was one of gradual return to a base state of perfect equilibrium, and in this equilibrium, a different kind of presence emerged. It was the presence of all the careful attention ever poured into this space. The thousands of hours of patient focus from Mr. Hemsley and the clockmakers before him had not vanished. They had accumulated. They were absorbed into the wood of the bench, into the handles of the tools, into the very air. The room was charged with a quiet intentionality. It was a sanctuary not just from sound, but from rush, from worry, from the sharp edges of unresolved thought. To be in this dark room was to be immersed in a medium of profound patience. A slow, almost musical sound began, a series of 3 tiny clear pings, like a minuscule, distant bell. It came from the black ceramic dish where the 4 brass screws had rested. As the temperature dropped further, the dish, the screws, and the wood of the bench beneath it contracted at infinitesimally different rates. The tensions created by this differential contraction were released in these tiny crystalline sounds. The screws settled a final, microscopic degree into their resting places. Then, true stillness. The sighing of the timbers ceased. The popping stopped. The scents hung motionless in the air, no longer spreading. The darkness was complete and uniform. It was a soft, velvety blackness that had weight and texture. It was not a void, but a substance. It was the quiet made visible. In this darkness, if one could see, one would observe only the faintest suggestion of shapes, the deeper black of an open cabinet against the wall black, the slight sheen of a glass face here and there, like a sleeping eye, but mostly it was a single, unified field of rest. The shop dreamed. Well, it dreamed not in images, but in sensations. It dreamed of the warmth of hands on wood. It dreamed of the smooth glide of a perfectly fitted screw. It dreamed of the golden light of 1,000 afternoons, pooling in the same spot on the floor. It dreamed of the slow, patient exhalation of a man completely absorbed in a task that had no deadline, only a standard of care. It held this dream state for hours, a vessel of perfect, untroubled peace. Then, the first hint of change, not a sound, but a subtle, almost imagined lightening of the darkness in the very highest corner of the window, facing east. The deep, inky black softened to a charcoal gray. This gray had no source yet. It was merely the night beginning to dilute. Minutes passed, each one as slow and heavy as cold syrup. The charcoal gray lightened further, becoming a soft, dusky blue. It was the blue of the deepest part of the hour before dawn. This faint illumination began to etch the outlines of the window frame against the greater darkness of the wall. It touched the upper shelves, revealing the ghostly, shrouded shapes of clocks waiting for their turn on the bench. The process was glacial, silent, and utterly inevitable. Inside the carriage clock, the oil in its pivots, having settled completely overnight, now formed perfect concave meniscuses at the edges of each bearing. They were ready. The brass, cooled by the night, felt firm and expectant. The long case clock, though unwound, began to sense the shift. Its silent pendulum, hanging dead center, seemed to hum with a potential for movement, as if it remembered the arc it was meant to describe. The dust on the surfaces, so still for hours, began to stir, not from a breeze, for there was none, but from the most minute thermal currents as the very first, faint warmth of the impending dawn touched the outside of the window glass. A single mote, a tiny fleck of dried pine resin, detached from the edge of the workbench and began a slow, spiraling descent through the blue-gray air. It took a full minute to fall 3 inches. The shop was not waking. Until waking implied a suddenness. It was emerging. It was returning with infinite slowness from the deep, dark pool of night towards the shallows of day. The blue-gray light warmed by a degree, hinting at the pearl and lilac to come. It found the brass handle of a drawer and turned it into a faint, glowing line. It kissed the curve of a porcelain dial on a shelf, making it gleam like a distant, cloudy moon. All was in order. All was at peace. All was waiting, with boundless patience, for the sound of a key in the lock, the sigh of the door opening, and the gentle, familiar presence that would, without hurry, invite the golden light back in, and begin the cycle of care anew. The night had been a long, slow exhalation. Now the room held its breath, ready for the inhalation. The pearl lilac light did not flood. It seeped. It was a liquid dawn, spilling over the sill and across the floorboards with a silent, deliberate gravity. It found the dust motes first, turning them from gray ghosts into flecks of suspended gold. They began their slow, languid dance once more, no longer driven by the memory of yesterday's warmth, but by the gentle promise of the new day's arrival. They swirled in currents too slow to feel, rising on columns of air, warmed by the faintest touch of light through glass. The shop began to remember its shape. The long case clock emerged from the gloom as a tall, solemn sentinel. The maple of its case warmed from a dark shadow to a soft, honeyed brown. Its brass pendulum, still motionless, caught the nascent light and held it in a dull, respectful gleam. The hands on its face, pointing to a real, forgotten hour, became thin, black lines against the creamy porcelain. On the shelf, the carriage clock's rosewood casing drank the light and glowed with a deep, sanguine light, as if a banked fire stirred within the wood. The blued steel hands remained dark, but the polished brass of its bezel around the glass winked a single sleepy eye. The workbench was a vast, empty plain of golden pine, the leather pad a dark continent at its center. The tools in their tray lay in orderly ranks, shadows pooling in the hollows between them. Everything was exactly as it had been left. the folded linen cloth in the basket by the door. Oi! The cedar box shut tight. The air, though still cool, had lost the sharp, metallic chill of deep night. It now held the neutral temperature of a cave. A constant, gentle coolness. Then, the first sound from the outside world that managed to penetrate the quiet. Not a cart, not a voice, a bird. A single clear note from a robin perched on the cobbled lane outside. It was not a song, but a statement, a droplet of sound that landed in the silence, causing a single, tiny ripple that spread and then vanished. Absorbed by the stillness, minutes pooled. The light strengthened, yellowing at its edges. The panel on the floor was now a distinct, sharp-cornered shape, its leading edge creeping towards the legs of the workbench stool. The sound of the world outside remained a muffled, distant thing, a rumor of life happening elsewhere. Then, a new sound, not from outside, but from the very fabric of the lane. A soft, rhythmic shush. Shush. It was the sound of a birch twig broom on wet cobblestones. Caretaker of the lane, an even older man than Mr. Hemsley, was beginning his morning ritual. The sound was methodical, meditative. Shush, pause, shush, pause. It was a sound of care, of order being gently applied to the world. It harmonized perfectly with the sleeping ethos of the shop. Inside, the light grew bold enough to reveal texture. The grain of the pine workbench became a topography of soft ridges and valleys. The woven fibers of the basket by the door threw a delicate, crisscross shadow. The brass screws in the ceramic dish were no longer just specks, but tiny, intricate objects, their slots dark lines in the growing gold. A change in the air pressure. Wow. A subtle, almost imperceptible compression, followed by a faint sigh. It was the building breathing as the sun's first direct ray touched its eastern-facing roof tiles, warming them a fraction of a degree, causing the ancient wood and plaster to expand by a hair's breadth. In the carriage clock, a miracle of physics occurred. Unseen, the tiny drop of oil on the pallet fork jewel, having settled perfectly overnight, quivered, not from movement, but from a change in surface, tension as the temperature around it rose by a single degree. It adjusted its shape, becoming slightly more convex, a little more ready. The shush, shush outside stopped. A period of deeper quiet followed, as if the lane itself were pausing to listen. Then, the sound that the shop, in its deep material way, had been waiting for. Not a bird, not a broom, a footstep. A single, solid click of a leather heel on stone. It was a familiar weight, a familiar rhythm. It was not hurried. It was the sound of approach, but of an approach that held no urgency, only the certainty of arrival. The footsteps came closer. Click. Pause for 2 heartbeats. Click. Pause. They stopped outside the door. A jingle, soft and metallic, a key ring being drawn from a deep pocket. The sound of the iron key, the very one that had issued the final clack of closure. Searching for, and then finding, the lock. The metal slid into the metal with a smooth, well-worn sound. A turn. A heavy, satisfying clunk as the bolt retracted into the door. A pause. Then, the door opened. It did not swing wide. It opened just enough, with a soft, sighing creak of its hinges, recently oiled. A tall, slender silhouette filled the space backlit by the cool morning gray light of the lane. Mr. Hensley stepped inside. "Hey, holy gee, whoa." He brought the outside in with him. A whisper of fresh damp air, the faint green scent of dew on stone. He stood for a moment on the threshold, allowing his eyes, older and accustomed to the softer interior light, to adjust. He was not surveying his domain. He was greeting it. His gaze traveled slowly over the familiar shapes emerging from the dust. The bench, the long case clock, the shelf with the dark rosewood carriage clock. He closed the door behind him. The sigh of the hinges again, then the solid thump of wood meeting frame. The lock remained unturned. The day had no need for locks. And the outside world was once again reduced to a muted present. The light from the window was now the dominant source, and with him in the room, it seemed to brighten, as if his presence completed a circuit. He walked to the center of the room, his footsteps silent on the worn floorboard. He did not go immediately to the workbench. He went first to the long case clock. He stood before it, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He looked up at its face. He observed the time. It was wrong, of course, having run down in the night. He did not frown. Maybe not frown. He simply noted it. He reached up, opened a little door in its waist, and with a firm, smooth pull, began to draw up the weights on their silken cord. The sound was a soft, gritty, musical shush. Shush as the cords wound onto their drums deep within the case. He raised the heavier weight first, then the lighter one. He closed the door. Then, with a gentle nudge of his index finger, he set the great pendulum in motion. It hesitated for a micro-moment, then swung. A smooth, deliberate arc to the left. A pause at the apex, then back to the right. Talk. Hello. Loy. A deeper, more resonant sound than yesterday. The clock, wound and respected, had found its voice again. Talk. And he gave a single, slow nod. Now, he turned to the day. He removed his wool coat, folded it once lengthwise, and laid it over the back of the unused stool in the corner. He rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, not with brisk efficiency, but with a careful, fold-by-fold precision, revealing forearms that were still pale and strong. He walked to the workbench, but he did not sit immediately. He placed his hands flat on the smooth pine, leaning his weight on them slightly, feeling the solidity of the wood, reacquainting himself with its particular give and resistance. He looked out the window at the now fully realized morning. Then he drew out the stool. He sat. He pulled the leather pad an inch closer. He aligned it. He let his elbows settle into their familiar depressions. He breathed in. The air smelled of lemon oil, pine, and the faint, clean scent of his own laundry soap. He breathed out. His eyes traveled across the empty workbench. They held no search for what to do next. They held only a calm, open readiness. The carriage clock gleamed on its shelf. A drawer held a half-restored verge escapement from a 17th century lantern clock. A box contained a nest of tangled watch chains needing untangling. It did not matter. There was no list. There was only now, and the quiet potential in every object in the room. He sat in the golden, dusty light, with the talk, breathing behind him. The shop was awake. The cycle of gentle attention had begun its new, unhurried revolution. The night's long exhale was complete. This was the inhalation, deep, slow, and filled with the peace of a purpose that would unfold at the only speed that mattered. The speed of care. The inhalation held. His hands remained on the leather pad, not resting, but poised in that state of potential that was neither action nor inaction. His gaze drifted past the empty space on the bench, past the shelf with the gleaming carriage clock, and settled on a small lidded wooden box on a higher shelf. It was a plain box, made of a wood so pale it was almost white. Holly, perhaps, or sycamore. It held no label, but he knew its contents. It held not a mechanism to be repaired, but a problem to be considered. A quiet puzzle, pocket watch whose balance wheel refused to be true, not due to dirt or lack of oil, but due to a mystery. It was a problem for later, perhaps for this afternoon, when the light was direct and sharp. For now, the morning asked for something simpler, something of rhythm and repetition. But his eyes lowered to a wide, shallow basket under the workbench. It was filled with raw materials of his craft, small, rough blocks of wood of various types, pieces of antler, slices of ivory, old legal ivory, from keys of long-vanished pianos, and lumps of dark horn. He reached down and selected a block of boxwood, about the size of his palm. It was unshaped, its surface still rough from the saw, pale and blonde. He set it on the white linen cloth he had laid out anew, a fresh one, smelling of wind and sun. He did not reach for a carving tool. Not yet. No. He picked up the block and held it in his left hand. He turned it over, feeling its weight. He ran the pad of his thumb across its rough face, feeling the tiny, fibrous teeth of the grain. He brought it close to his face and inhaled. The scent was sweet and dry, like hay stored in a clean lot. It was the smell of potential. He set it down in the center of the cloth. From a drawer, he selected a single piece of paper, a thick, creamy sheet with a slight tooth. With a pencil whose lead was worn to a perfect, rounded point, he began not to draw, but to trace. He placed the boxwood block on the paper and ran the pencil around its perimeter. The sound was a soft, granular whisper, whisper, whisper. He now had a pale, fuzzy rectangle on the paper. Within this rectangle, with slow, sure strokes, he began to sketch the outline of a clock's chapter ring, the flat, engraved disc that would sit behind the hands, marked with the hours and minutes. He did not draw numerals. Well, he drew 2 concentric circles, their lines steady and without tremor. The space between them was the territory of the future. He then drew the faintest of crosses through the center, marking the cardinal points, 12 to 32. This was the skeleton. The rest, the delicate, spidery lines for the minute marks, the elegant Roman numerals, would come later, transferred from ancient patterns he kept in a portfolio of worn leather. For now, it was only the shape on paper, a ghost of what the boxwood might become. He set the paper aside, anchoring it with a small smooth river stone that served as a paperweight. He picked up the block of wood again. This time, he selected a tool, a small, fine-toothed backsaw. He fixed the block in a vise on the corner of the bench, tightening the jaws just enough to hold it firm without crushing the delicate fibers. He sighted along the pencil line he had made directly on the wood, a line indicating the first cut to reduce the block to a rough disc. He began to saw. The sound was not harsh, but a rhythmic, soothing Z-up, Z-up, O-up. The fine teeth bit into the boxwood, releasing a puff of sweet-smelling dust that hung in a sunbeam like powdered gold. His arm moved with a piston-like regularity, not fast, but with a steady, relentless patience. The saw did the work. He merely guided it, his focus on keeping the blade perfectly perpendicular, the line perfectly straight. Say up. A slight pull back. Z up. The long case clock marked the passing of this rhythm with its own talk. Saw stroke. Talk. Saw stroke. Shavings, thick and curly, like pale wood shavings from a child's pencil sharpener, coiled from the cut and fell in a soft pile on the bed. The smell of boxwood grew stronger, a clean, workshop perfume. The block began to separate along the line. The sound changed as the cut deepened, becoming slightly lower in pitch, a contented hum of progress. His world contracted to the line, the blade, the growing gap. His breathing synchronized with the strokes. In on the pull back, out on the push forward. It was a meditation action. In, there was no goal of a finished chapter ring. Yet, there was only this cut, this moment, the feeling of the saw's handle in his palm, the resistance of the wood giving way in tiny, bite-sized increments. Finally, with a last gentle Z-speak, the waste piece fell away, landing softly on the pile of shaving. He released the vise. He lifted the now slabbed block. One face was rough from the saw, a texture of fine, parallel ridges. The other was still the original rough-sawn surface. He would need to plane it smooth, but not yet. He picked up the waste piece. It was an L-shaped offcut. He turned it over in his hand. It still had good size, good grain. It could become something else. A small knob, perhaps. Or a spacer. He did not discard it. He placed it carefully in a different basket, one labeled Useful Remnants. Nothing was wasted here. Everything held potential for future, quieter moments. He resecured the main block in the vise, now to trim another edge. He picked up the saw again. The ritual repeated. The measuring, the sighting, the slow, rhythmic Z-up, Z-up, up. Another curl of pale dust. Another offcut placed in the basket. The rectangle of wood, slowly, incrementally, approached the shape of a crude disk. Outside, the morning solidified. The light through the window lost its watery delicacy and took on the solid, transparent quality of mature daylight. It no longer pooled. It flooded. It lit the floating dust from the sawing into a swirling galaxy of gold. The sound of the world outside became a little more distinct. A distant bell from the town hall marking the hour. The faint cry of a street vendor several lanes over, but it remained behind a veil. The primary sounds were the saw, the clock, and the soft rustle of shavings falling. He worked until the block was a rough octagon. Then began the more careful process of paring down the corners to approach a circle. He switched tools, now using a small, sharp block plane. This sound was different. A crisp, slicing shock as the blade sheared off a translucent curl of boxwood. The shavings now were thin and delicate, like parchment, curling into perfect woody commas. They fluttered down, piling up in a heap that looked like pale, ruffled feathers. He planned with a gentle, rocking motion, his eye constantly judging the curve. He would plane a few strokes, pick up the emerging disc, roll it in his fingers to feel for high spots, hold it up to squint along its edge, then back to the vise, another few strokes. Shh, shh, shh. It was a conversation between him, the tool, and the wood. The wood spoke through its resistance. Plane spoke through the quality of its cut. He listened and adjusted his pressure, his angle. Slowly, under his hands, the angular block began to soften. The sharp corners melted away. The shape became organic, a stone worn smooth by a river of attention. It was not yet a circle, but it was no longer a thing of lines and angles. It was becoming, and that was enough for now. On the morning's task, the first reduction, the journey from roll block to nascent disc, was complete. He set the plane down. He released the wood from the vise and held the pale, softly rounded shape in his palm. It was warm from the friction and from his hand. He ran his thumb over its surface. It was still rough, still far from smooth, but it held the promise of the circle within it. He placed it carefully on the linen cloth, next to the ghostly drawing on the paper. They were companions now, the idea and the substance. He brushed the pile of shavings from the bench into a larger basket with a small, soft, bristled hand broom. The sound was a dry, whispering cascade. Then he sat back. He looked at the two objects on the cloth, the sketch and the shaped wood. The beginning had been made. A line had been drawn, both on paper and in time. The arc of the day was established. It would be a day of shaping, of gentle persuasion, of bringing form out of formlessness. The talk behind him agreed. It measured the space between actions, the quiet satisfaction of a morning's subtle progress. The sunbeam had climbed the leg of the stool now, warming the wood. The shop was full of light, full of the sweet smell of boxwood, full of a calm, productive peace. The next step, the careful, patient sanding of the disc to a perfect circle, could wait. For now, there was the silent contemplation of what had been begun, and the deep, unhurried breath before the next gentle effort. The pause was not empty. It was filled with the substance of what had just been done. The scent of boxwood, released from the interior of the block where it had been sealed for years, now mingled with the older smells of the shop, adding a bright green note to the symphony of pine resin and metal. He watched the dust motes, stirred by his sweeping, perform their final slow-motion waltz. Before settling once more into stillness, they drifted through the beam of sun that was now a solid bar of light, connecting the window to the edge of his bench, a luminous bridge between the outside world and this quiet interior. His hand, without conscious instruction, reached for the disc of boxwood again, not to work it, but to feel it. He turned it over in his fingers, his touch reading its surface like blind script. The plane had left it with a texture like very fine sandpaper, a uniform roughness that was pleasing in its honesty. He could feel the subtle undulations, the almost imperceptible high spots his eye had missed. He closed his eyes, letting his fingertips become his world. The wood was warm, alive. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the disc became a planet, its topography mapped by nerve ending. He opened his eyes and set it down. From a drawer lined with felt, he selected a sheet of abrasive paper, not modern sandpaper with its harsh grit and garish backing, but an older kind, ground glass glued to a thick, pliable paper the color of manila. It was gentle. He tore off a small square, about the size of a postage stamp. He folded it, grit side out, into a tight, precise pad. He picked up the disc and the abrasive pad. He did not return to the vise. This work required freedom of movement, a constant, rolling pressure. He held the disc in the palm of his left hand, cradling it. With his right, he began to rub the abrasive pad in small circular motions over the surface. The sound was a soft, dry shh, like the whisper of a breeze through tall, parched grass. It was a sound of erosion, but of a purposeful, loving erosion. Each tiny, glassy grain on the paper was a miniature sculptor, shearing away the microscopic peaks on the boxwood surface, reducing them to dust even finer than before. He worked with a slow, rhythmic pressure. 3 circles clockwise, pause. 3 circles, counterclockwise, pause. His breath fell into time with it. In for 3 circles, hold during the pause. Out for 3 circles. The rhythm was hypnotic, a silent chant performed by hand and breath. The pale, dusty film that gathered on the wood was the ghost of its former roughness. He blew on it gently, and it vanished in a small cloud, leaving behind a surface just slightly smoother, just slightly closer to perfect. He turned the disc over in his palm and began on the other face. Shh. Circle. Circle. Pause. The time dissolved into the repetition. The long case clock's ticks became part of the fabric, not marking minutes, but providing a soft, percussive underscore to the abrasive whisper. The light in the room shifted, the sunbeam crawling across the bench like the slow hand of a sundial. But he did not notice. His universe was the disc, the pad, the growing smoothness. After a long while, he stopped. He examined the wood under the light, tilting it. The rough, matte finish was gone. It now had a soft, uniform sheen, like the skin of a dove. But it was not yet smooth enough for a chapter ring. It needed to be flawless, so that the engraver's tool would glide without catch, so that the ink of the numerals would sit perfectly in their grooves. He put the first sheet of abrasive paper aside. From the same drawer, he selected another sheet, this one with a grit as fine as powdered sugar. He tore another square, folded it. The process began again. Shh. But this sound was even softer, a mere suggestion of friction. It was the sound of silk brushing silk. This was not shaping anymore. This was polishing at a molecular level. His movements became even smaller, even more deliberate. He was not just smoothing the wood, he was burnishing it, compressing the very fibers with the gentle, persistent heat of friction. The boxwood, under this tender assault, began to change. Its pale blonde color warmed, taking on a faint, honeyed glow. The natural luster of the wood, hidden since it was a tree, began to emerge. He lost himself in the sensation, the feeling of the wood growing slick under his fingers, the slight warmth generated by the endless, tiny circles, the mesmerizing, silent fall of ultra-fine dust. His mind was a clear, still pool. Thoughts came and went like small, weightless insects, skimming the surface, leaving no ripple. There was only the circle, the whisper, the breath. He did not know how long he sanded. Oh, it might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. He stopped only when his fingertips, sliding over the surface, could detect no transition, no catch, no flaw. It was uniformly smooth. It felt less like wood and more like a stone worn by 1,000 years in a gentle stream. He blew the last of the fine dust away. He held the disc up, turning it in the sunbeam. It glowed. It was a perfect, thin circle of warm, honey-colored boxwood, its edges softly rounded. It was ready to receive the marks of time. He set it down carefully on the clean linen, next to the paper sketch, the ghost, and the substance. The idea had taken a monumental step towards reality. His fingers ached faintly, a pleasant, deep ache of use. He flexed them, watching the tendons move under the skin. He looked at the pile of fine, pale dust that had accumulated on the bench. With the small hand broom, he swept it into a pristine, white dish. This dust was too fine to discard. It would be mixed with a little linseed oil to make a filler paste, useful for other projects. Nothing was wasted. He stood up, his knees protesting softly after so long in one position. He walked to the small sink in the corner, a deep porcelain basin with a single copper tap. He turned the tap. The water emerged with a groan and a sputter, then settled into a clear, cold stream. He washed his hands, the water turning milky with boxwood dust. He dried them on a rough cotton towel hanging from a hook. He returned to the bench, but did not sit. Instead, he went to the window and looked out. The morning had firmly become midday. The sky was a high, pale blue. A single puffy cloud, brilliant white, drifted with majestic slowness across his frame of view. In the lane below, a black cat sat on the warm cobbles, meticulously washing a forepaw. Life proceeded, quietly. He watched the cloud until it passed from view. He watched the cat finish its paw and begin on the other. There was no hurry in anything. Turning back to the room, his eyes fell upon the holly box on the high shelf, the puzzle watch. The morning's rhythmic, physical work had cleared the channels of his mind. The quiet focus of sanding had been a preparation. He felt a pull towards the mystery now, a gentle curiosity. He fetched a small step stool, climbed up, and carefully brought the box down. It was lighter than it looked. He carried it to the bench, not to the main work area, but to a smaller secondary clearing to the left, reserved for contemplation more than action. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of midnight blue velvet, was a hunter-cased pocket watch. Its outer case was plain, worn silver, devoid of engraving. He lifted it out. It was heavy, solid. He pressed the crown, and the front spring-hinged lid snapped open with a satisfying click. The face was classic, elegant, white enamel with black Roman numerals, a sub-dial for seconds at the 6 o'clock position. The blued steel hands were perfectly poised. It was a beautiful, serious instrument. He turned it over. On the back, he opened the rear lid as well, revealing the movement. And here was the mystery. It was clean. It was oiled. All its parts were present and seemingly correct. But when he had last gently wound it and gave it a shake, the balance wheel, the tiny, oscillating heart that regulated all, had stuttered. It would swing for a few moments, a brave, ticking pulse, and then falter as if losing courage. It was not a lack of power. The mainspring was strong. It was not an obvious obstruction. It was a subtle, philosophical fault, a hesitation in its soul. He did not touch it now. He simply looked at it, lying there in its blue velvet nest. He observed the way the light fell on the spiral of the hairspring, the tiny, perfect jewel that held the balance staff. He was not looking for a solution. He was introducing himself to the problem anew, letting it sit in his awareness alongside the smooth, completed disc of boxwood. One task was pure, rhythmic doing. The other would be pure, quiet thinking. The day had its balance. He closed the lids of the box, but did not put it away. He left it there, on the periphery of his workspace, a silent companion. He returned to his stool. He looked at the beautiful, smooth disc of boxwood, ready for the next stage. He looked at the closed box holding its silent, stuttering heart. The afternoon stretched ahead, long and golden and full of quiet potential. There was no need to choose. There was only need to be present, to listen, and to respond with the next appropriate, gentle action. He sat down. The leather pad welcomed his elbows. The talk, measured the peaceful, empty moment of possibility before him. And so, he breathed. The breath he took was different now, deeper, slower, drawing the quiet of the shop, not just into his lungs, but into the very marrow of his concentration. The rhythmic physical work of the morning had been a prelude, a tuning of his instrument. Now, the music of pure deduction could begin. His eyes rested on the closed holly box. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he reached for a different drawer, one that held not tools, but ephemera. He withdrew a small blank notebook bound in black cloth, its pages unlined, and a pencil with a needle-fine point. These were the tools for thinking. He opened the notebook to a fresh page. At the top, in his small, precise script, he wrote, "Hunter, silver case, bellows, hesitation. Until loss here, unhurried." He did not write the date. Time in this investigation was irrelevant. Only then did he open the box. He did not remove the watch. He simply looked at it, lying in its blue sarcophagus. He began to write, not conclusions, but observation. Pour un adorned fact. 1. Clean, no visible dust or old oil on plate. 2. Jewel intact, no crack visible under 10x loop. Previous inspection. 3. Hairspring appears concentric, not touching balance cock or any obstruction. 4. Beat error, possibly. Lull, sound uneven before stalling. 5. Stalls regardless of amplitude, not a power issue. He paused, the pencil hovering. He closed his eyes, recalling the sound. He had listened to it yesterday, just once, before closing it away. The sound was not the healthy metallic tick-tock of a vigorous watch. It was a tick, ta-tock, tick, and then silence, a hesitation, a stumble in the dance. He opened his eyes and wrote, 6. Hesitation suggests an intermittent engagement, not a constant drag. He put the pencil down. He lifted the watch from the box, his touch reverent. He held it to his ear, though he knew it was silent. He was listening to its memory of silence. He pressed the crown and opened the front lid, then the back. The white enamel face stared blankly, innocently. The intricate movement behind it was a frozen city. He fetched his loupe, a simple, single lens, mounted on a wire frame that perched on his spectacles. The world magnified, falling away until only the tiny universe of the balance wheel and escapement filled his vision. He did not wind it, not yet. Lulled. First, he had to see. Under magnification, the familiar became alien. A landscape of gleaming cliffs and canyons. He started at the balance wheel itself. His eye traced its rim, looking for the slightest warp, the tiniest burr. Nothing. Nothing. It was a perfect golden circle. The hairspring, coiled tighter than a fiddlehead fern, pulsed with a potential energy that was almost visible. He followed its spiral out from the collet, watching the space between its coils. Maybe they were even. It did not breathe in and out, indicating a wobble. It lay flat. His gaze moved to the pallet fork, the slender, dart-shaped piece of polished steel that acted as the gatekeeper, locking and unlocking the escape wheel. Its jewels, the entry and exit pallet stones, were tiny, red, and flawless. He looked at their locking faces. Were they worn? A worn pallet would cause a loss of motion, a slipping, but not necessarily this delicate hesitation. He then examined the escape wheel itself. Its teeth were like a crown of tiny, perfect shark's teeth, each one sharp and even. He looked for a bent tooth, a speck of hardened oil. Nothing, nothing. He sat back, removing the loop. The magnified world receded, and the watch became small again. The mystery remained. All the components were perfect, yet the whole was flawed. This was the point where frustration might enter another workspace. Here, it only deepened the quiet. Problem without an obvious cause was not a threat. It was an invitation to a deeper conversation with the object. He set the watch down, its back open, on a special padded holder that kept it at a 45-degree angle. He needed to observe it in motion. But to set it in motion, he had to give it a chance to fail. He picked up a pair of brass tweezers with blunted tips, designed for handling, not for gripping. With them, he gently engaged the winding mechanism, turning the crown just 3 clicks. The faintest tension entered the mainspring. It was enough for a test, not enough to cause damage if something was wrong. He gave the watch a gentle, rocking turn in his hand. For a moment, nothing. Then, the balance wheel gave a convulsive shudder and began to swing. Tick, fallen. The pallet fork darted. Tock, tock. The escape wheel advanced a tooth. The second hand on the subdial twitched. He held his breath. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It ran for 5 seconds. 6. The sound was weak, anemic, but it was running. Then, on the 7th swing, the balance wheel seemed to hang at the far end of its arc for a millisecond too long. The pallet fork, expecting to be impulsed back, hesitated. The escape wheel tooth, not properly released, pressed back against the pallet jewel. There was a faint, almost inaudible scrape. Ta, ta. The rhythm was broken. The balance wheel swing diminished, dampened by the tiny conflict. It swung back, weaker. The next tick was a whisper, and then silence. The wheel settled into stillness, pointing slightly off-center. A ship run aground. He had seen it. Not the cause, but the symptom. The failure happened at the moment of impulse, when the escape wheel tooth should slip off the pallet jewel and give the balance wheel a tiny, vital push to keep it swinging. That transfer of energy was being interrupted. He picked up the pencil. He wrote I-7. Fault at impulse. Impulse. Undo. Engagement. Release on exit pallet. Now, the field of inquiry had narrowed from the entire universe of the watch to a single, microscopic transaction between one jewel face and one escape wheel tooth. He did not dive back in with the loop. He sat still. He visualized the action in his mind's eye, slowed down 1,000 times. The tooth sliding up the locking face of the jewel, reaching the tip, starting to slip over to drop onto the impulse face, the angled plane that would give the push. And something happened. A catch. Was the jewel chipped? Not on its face, but on its very corner? Was the escape wheel tooth not perfectly shaped? He needed a different perspective. He needed to see the interaction from the side. He rummaged in a lower cabinet and brought out a peculiar device, a watchmaker's timing machine from a bygone era. It was not electronic, but mechanical. A simple, sensitive microphone on a gooseneck arm connected to a smoked glass disc that could be rotated. The principle was ancient. The ticks would be recorded as tiny, burnt marks on the glass, their spacing revealing the beat. He set it up, positioning the microphone a centimeter from the balance cock. He wound the watch another 2 clicks. He started the smoked glass disc, rotating with a gentle turn of a crank. He gave the watch its starting rock. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tick. He stopped the disc. He lifted it carefully and carried it to the window. In the bright light, the pattern emerged. A series of crisp, black dots, evenly spaced at first. Then, a wobble in the spacing. Then 2 dots too close together. The ta-talk, followed by a growing gap as the beats weakened. Then nothing. The visual proof was there. The hesitation was a stutter in the rhythm, a stumble in the step. He returned to the bench, a quiet certainty forming. The problem was not in the parts themselves, but in their relationship. Something about the geometry of the escapement in this specific watch, perhaps exacerbated by a hair's breadth wear over a century, was causing this momentary lock. The solution would not be replacement. It would be adjustment, the most delicate kind, adjusting the banking pins that limited the swing of the palette fork by a fraction of a millimeter, or even more delicate, slightly altering the draw of the palette stones, the angle that kept them safely locked against the escape wheel teeth. This was work for a steady hand, a calm heart, and absolute confidence. It was work for the very end of the day, when the light was long and golden, and his mind was a still deep lake. For now, he had the answer. He knew the where, if not the precise how. He closed the watch, placing it back in its box. He closed the notebook. He put away the timing machine. The investigative phase was complete. The active phase would come later. He turned his chair slightly, and his gaze fell upon the disc of boxwood, glowing warmly on the linen. After the intense, inward-focused scrutiny of the watch, the disc offered a blissful simplicity. It asked only for the transfer of an image, a physical act of creation. He picked up the paper with his sketch. He opened a pot of a thick, dark paste, a mixture of lampblack and oil. With a fine brush, he blackened the back of the paper where the pencil lines were. Then, he placed the paper, blackened side down, onto the surface of the boxwood disc. He took a smooth, hard agate burnisher and began to trace over his pencil lines on the front of the paper. Firm, smooth pressure, a gentle, grating whisper. He was transferring the ghost onto the substance. When he lifted the paper, a faint black outline of the 2 concentric circles and the cross was now on the pale wood. A faint, sooty promise. He put the paper away. He selected the smallest, sharpest graver from a roll of tulle, a sliver of hardened steel with a wooden handle, its cutting edge a perfect polished V. He positioned the disc on a leather sandbag that would cradle it and allow it to be turned. He took the graver in his right hand, positioning its heel in the cup of his palm, his fingers guiding the shaft. He placed the needle-like point at the beginning of the outer transferred circle. He took a breath and let it out halfway. He held it. Then he pushed. The graver bit into the boxwood with a crisp, quiet snick. A tiny, perfect curl of pale wood lifted from the surface, leaving behind a clean, V-shaped groove. He pulled the tool towards him, guiding it along the sooty line. The sound was a continuous, soft crinkle-crinkle, like the sound of walking on very fine, frozen snow. The groove deepened, following the curve with unwavering fidelity. His hand was steady, his eye fixed not on the tool, but on the point where the cutting edge met the wood. Anticipating the curve, he cut the outer circle. Then, without pause, he moved the inner circle. Snick, crinkle, crinkle, crinkle. The two lines ran parallel, a hair's breadth apart, defining the sacred space for the hours. The shop held its breath with him. The only sounds were the crisp incision of the graver and the slow, patient exhalation of his lungs. When he finally allowed himself to breathe at the end of a cut, he was no longer repairing. He was no longer diagnosing. He was creating. And in the crisp, definitive act of carving a perfect line into waiting wood, the last lingering vibration from the watch's mysterious hesitation was smoothed away, absorbed into the final crinkle of the graver's cut faded into the room's quiet, like a stone sinking into deep water. He held the disc up, tilting it in the long, late afternoon light. The two grooves, outer and inner, were clean and sharp. A pair of dark rings etched into the honey-colored wood. Between them lay a smooth, untouched band, the territory of the hours. He blew gently across the surface, and a few clinging particles of soot and wood dust vanished, leaving the lines crisp and pure. He set the disc down on the sandbag. The next step was the most demanding, the one that required not just a steady hand, but a kind of serene, unwavering focus that flowed from the very center of his being, the numerals. He did not reach for the graver again. First, he went to the old leather portfolio. He unbuckled its strap and laid it open on a clear part of the bench. Inside were not printed designs, but sheets of thick, cream-colored paper covered in his own handwriting. And these were his master patterns, painstakingly copied and adapted from antique horology texts over decades. Each numeral style had its own page. The elegant, spindly art Nouveau numbers, the stout, serious black-letter Gothic, the rational, clean-faced numerals of the railway watches. For this chapter ring, for this simple carriage clock case, the choice was clear. He turned to the page marked Roman, serif-ed, classic proportion. The numerals were drawn with a fine-nibbed pen, each one a small masterpiece of balance and weight. The serifs, the tiny finishing strokes at the ends of the letter lines, were not mere decoration. They gave the numerals a grounded, permanent look, as if they had grown from the dial rather than being applied to it. He would not trace these. Oh, he had done that stage with the circles. Now, he had to draw them freehand, directly onto the wood, using the pattern only as a spiritual guide. He selected a drafting pencil, so sharp, its point was a needle of graphite. He leaned over the disc, his nose inches from the wood. He began, not at the 12, but at the z's. It was a simple numeral, 2 vertical lines. It would anchor the others. His hand moved with a slow, fluid certainty. The pencil made a faint, silvery whisper as it laid down a perfectly vertical line. Then another, parallel and exactly the right distance apart. He then sketched the gentle outward flares at the top and bottom, the serifs. The numerals X appeared on the boxwood as a pale gray ghost, elegant and assured. He moved clockwise. V. This was trickier. A diagonal stroke down, a diagonal stroke up meeting in a sharp point, then a horizontal crossbar. He drew the 2 diagonals first, judging their angle by eye, making them mirror images. Then the connecting crossbar, perfectly level. The ghost of a V took its place next to the phi. Very tired. My T. But those by T. A vertical line for the eye. Then the V beside it, slightly narrower than the stand alone. V. He drew them as a single entity, ensuring the spacing between I and the VEV was visually identical to the spaces within the other numerals. He continued. Three vertical lines, the middle one slightly shorter, the serifs linking them into a single, cohesive unit. Two lines, I, a single confident stroke. Then he crossed the top of the circle. This was the most complex on the dial, an X and an 2 combined. He drew the X first, 2 crossing diagonals, their intersection perfectly centered. Then the 2 vertical lines of the 2, aligned so the whole numeral sat in harmonious balance, neither too wide nor too tall. It was a test of spatial judgment, and his pencil passed without hesitation. Shall be X and I, X, the 2 crossing diagonals, pure and simple. 9, 10, I and X, a mirror of the G, but reversed. He completed the circle with 7 and 8, rounding back to meet the starting point near the side shawl. He sat back, blinking to bring the wider room back into focus. A ring of pale, perfect Roman numerals now encircled the disc. They were mere suggestions in graphite, but they held the complete authority of the final form. But he had drawn them not as separate numbers, but as parts of a continuous, unbroken sequence, each one in correct proportional relationship to its neighbors, and to the space that contained them. The light had changed. The solid bar of sunlight was now a slanted, rich orange beam, thick with motes, cutting across the bench and painting the far wall in gold. The long case clock ticked its slower, deeper evening rhythm. Talk. A long pause. Talk. The time for graver work was over. That was a task for the clear, even light of morning. Engraving these delicate ghosts required a freshness of eye he no longer possessed. The drawing was the intellectual work. The cutting would be the physical fulfillment. They belonged to different days. He was not disappointed. He felt a deep satisfaction. The disc had been transformed twice. First, from a block to a circle. Now from a circle to a map of time. The day's creative work was complete. He placed the disc carefully inside a shallow drawer lined with green baize, where it would sleep safely, its graphite ghosts undisturbed. He turned now to the holly box. What puzzle? The puzzle, the investigative work was done. The quiet contemplation of the afternoon had offered no further flash of insight, only a solidified understanding. The fault was in the geometry of the impulse. Adjustment of unimaginable slightness was required. This was not work for the thinking mind, nor for the creative hand. This was work for the feeling hand, the hand that knew pressure and resistance in dimensions smaller than thought. It was work for the very edge of the day, when the world was softening into shadow and the boundaries between intuition and skill dissolved. He opened the box. He did not put on his loop. He would work by feel and by the dim, ambient light now filling the shop. He took the watch and a pair of the most delicate screwdrivers. He opened the case, and, with movements so small they were barely perceptible, he loosened the two tiny screws that held the balance cock in place. He lifted the cock away, setting it aside on a piece of soft chamois. The balance wheel and its hairspring were now exposed. Vulnerable, a naked heart. He could see the pallet fork below it. He needed to adjust its banking, the tiny pins that stopped its swing. A hair's breadth movement inward would decrease the lock, potentially curing the hesitation, but a hair's breadth too much would cause the watch to race uncontrollably. It was a gamble of minuscule proportions. He selected a tool that was essentially a polished eel rod with a flat, angled end. He inserted it into the movement, finding the slot on the head of the left banking pin. He took a breath, held it, and turned the pin the smallest amount his fingers were capable of. 1 degree, perhaps less. He felt the microscopic click of the threads moving in their hole. He did not reassemble. He put the balance cock back, tightened the screws just enough, gave the watch a single careful wind and a gentle shake. The balance wheel shuddered, swung. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It ran. It ran for 10 seconds. 20. Its sound was still weak, but the rhythm was even. No talk. It ran for a full minute, a brave, tiny heartbeat in the silent room. Then it faltered, not a stumble, but a gentle winding down, like a child falling asleep mid-sentence. The amplitude of its swing decreased until it settled once more into stillness. It was better, but not right. He had expected this. The first adjustment was never the answer. It was a question posed to the mechanism. The answer had been closer, but not there. In the deepening gloom, he smiled, a faint lifting at the corners of his mouth. The conversation was progressing. He had nudged, and the watch had responded. Tomorrow, or the next day, he would nudge again, and again, again, until the perfect invisible point of equilibrium was found, where the lock was secure, but the impulse was free. He returned the watch to its box. He did not feel he had failed. He felt he had listened and been heard. He stood up. The shop was now in twilight. The oranges and golds had faded to blues and purples. The tools on the bench were dark-shaped. The long case clock's face was a pale, floating disk in the near darkness. He performed the evening ritual. He put away every tool, wiping each one with the soft cloth. He folded the linen. He brushed the bench clean of the day's accumulated dust. Boxwood, graphite, a fleck of brass. He wound the long case clock, his hands moving by touch in the dark. He set its pendulum swinging. Talk, talk. The sound was a comfort, a declaration that order prevailed. He put on his coat. He walked to the door. He stood for a moment, looking back into the dark, familiar space. The chapter ring slept in its drawer. The puzzle watch rested in its box. The carriage clock gleamed dully on its shelf. All was cared for. All was at peace with its state of becoming. He opened the door. The cool evening air, smelling of night-blooming flowers and cool earth, washed over him. He stepped out. He closed the door. The lock turned with a solid, final clack. Inside, the darkness was complete, save for the pale face of the long case clock. The talk, was the only pulse in a world of restful shadows. The shop dreamed now of lines drawn, of mysteries probed, of adjustments measured in degrees, smaller than a breath. It held the day's quiet industry within its walls like a scent, and settled, content, into the long, silent watch of the night. The silence after the lock turned was a different creature than the night before. It was not the empty silence of a beginning, but the full, satisfied silence of a cycle completed. The day's work, the sanding, the sketching, the delicate investigation, the mint adjustment, hung in the air not as unfinished business, but as contributions to a permanent, gentle tension. The shop was a vessel now brimming with patient progress. In the absolute dark, the smell of boxwood was still present, but it had melded with the older smells into a single complex fragrance, the scent of the shop's own life. The lemon oil from the carriage clock had faded completely, absorbed. The metallic whisper was fainter. The dominant note was the dry, sweet perfume of worked wood and stone dust. The timbers did not creak as they cooled. They had settled into their nightly stance hours ago. The only sound was the long case clock's pendulum, carving its unwavering arc through the blackness. Talk, a soft, woody impact. Talk, a softer echo. It was the heartbeat of the sleeping room. On the green baize in the shallow drawer, the boxwood disc lay in perfect darkness, but if a light were to shine, it would reveal the pale graphite ghosts of the Roman numerals, holding their positions with serene confidence. They were a promise etched in carbon, waiting for the permanence of the graver's edge. The disc itself seemed to have relaxed after the intensity of the pencil's touch, its fibers settling around the memory of the lines. In the holly box, the silver hunter watch was a cool, dense weight on its blue velvet. Inside its casing, the balance wheel sat still, but the adjustment he had made, that 1-degree turn of the banking pin, had changed everything. The potential energy in the mainspring was now met with a slightly different landscape in the escapement. It was a landscape of possibility. The fault was not cured, but it had been shifted, prodded. The watch was no longer stubbornly silent. It was thoughtfully silent, considering the new parameters. The rosewood carriage clock on the shelf was perhaps the most content. It had been cleaned, oiled, polished, and set to a neutral time. Its purpose was fulfilled for now. It was a closed loop of beauty and readiness. The oil within it had finished its slow gravitational seep, coating every pivot in a perfect microscopic film. It dreamed simple dreams of static elegance. The night deepened. The darkness became a palpable texture, a velvet blanket laid over every surface. The single high window showed a square of night sky where a brave star or two winked through the city's haze. Then, something new. A sound so soft it was less a sound and more a tremor in the air. Pang. Lo Mosai. A ping. Not from the ceramic dish this time. It came from the direction of the workbench. It was the sound of metal cooling the final, infinitesimal degree. Perhaps the steel shaft of the graver, lying in its roll, contracting against the wood of the handle. It was a tiny, musical note, clear as a drop of water falling into a still well. It hung in the air for a moment and was gone, absorbed by the soft talk. A slow hour passed. The star in the window square tracked its invisible path. A change began, not with light, but with an almost imperceptible lightening of the quality of the darkness. It was as if the blackness was thinning, becoming less opaque. This was the true dead of night, the hour when even memories of light seemed forgotten. The long case clock's ticks seemed louder in this profound stillness, each one a small event in a void. It was in this deepest dark that the shop's true nature was most apparent. It was not a workshop waiting for a worker. It was an entity in its own right, a repository of focused attention. The piece within its walls was an active piece, a magnetic field generated by decades of unhurried care. It repelled frenzy. It dissolved anxiety. It was a balm made of pine and patience. Although dalmatation, the balance wheel in the hunter watch, though still, held within its coiled hairspring a new tension, a revised memory of its own motion. It was a tiny brain, processing the day's experiment. The boxwood disc in the drawer seemed to breathe, though it did not move. The wood, still alive in a sense, continued to adjust to its new carved lines, the fibers accepting the presence of the graphite. The night wore on. The first hint of change was, again, not light, but a silence within the silence. The long case clock's weights reached the end of their journey. The rhythmic talk slowed. The swings of the pendulum grew shallower, lazier. Talk. A longer pause. Talk. A pause longer still. Then a final, weak thought. And then nothing. The pendulum drifted to a stop, hanging dead vertical. The last sound had been made. The shop was now in absolute, perfect acoustic silence. The heartbeat had ceased. It was not an ominous stillness, but a profound one. Now, the room had entered a state of suspension, so complete it felt timeless. In this new quiet, even smaller phenomena became apparent. The gentle, almost electric hum of one's own blood in the ears, if one were there to hear it. Usher of the atmosphere itself. And then, the very first, faint suggestion of gray, not at the window, but seemingly in the air itself, is the pre-dawn light. So weak it could not yet be seen directly, but its presence began to negate the absolute blackness. Shapes in the room, the anvil of the vise, the bulk of the lathe, began to detach themselves from the void as even deeper patches of gloom. The silence held for a long time in this gray half-world. Then, a bird, the same robin, or its cousin, a single, questioning chirp. Patwaisi chirp. It was not a song, but a probe sent into the silence. It was met with no answer. Minutes dripped by, each one heavy and slow. The gray light concentrated at the window, turning the square of sky to the color of a dove's breast. The outlines of the window frame became sharp, vital. The tools on the bench emerged as a jumble of dark angles on a field of soft gray. Inside the hunter watch, in the perfect cool of the pre-dawn, the metals of the escapement contracted to their smallest size. The oil in its jewels thickened just a fraction. The watch held its new configuration in the cold. A frozen question. The boxwood disc felt the change in humidity as the night's moisture began to lift. It tightened imperceptibly, the wood's pores closing a little, making the surface just slightly harder, just slightly more ready for the bite of the graver. The carriage clock's rosewood case, polished to a closed pore, felt nothing. It simply continued to glow inwardly with its deep, sanguine potential. The light warmed from gray to a cool, luminous blue. The shop was now visible in all its still life detail, but without color, like an old photograph. The shush of the birch broom on the cobbles began again, a little later than yesterday. The caretaker was a creature of light, not of the clock. The blue light took on a pearl tint, then a faint blush of rose at its eastern edge, and then the footsteps, the same rhythm. Click, pause, click. They stopped. The jingle of keys, the scratch of iron in the lock, the deep clunk. The door opened. Mr. Hemsley entered, bringing with him the chill, dewy freshness of a morning that was still deciding what kind of day it would be. He did not pause on the threshold today. He moved with a quiet certainty to the long case clock. He wound the weights, his hands knowing the ropes by touch in the dim light. He set the pendulum swinging. He did not wait for the first thought. He turned and walked to the bench. He did not remove his coat. He did not sit. He went directly to the shallow drawer and lifted out the boxwood disc. He carried it to the window, holding it in the now strengthening pearl and rose light. He studied the graphite numerals, his eyes tracing their serifs, their proportion. He gave a small, approving nod. The ghosts were good. They were ready to be made real. He placed the disc back on the sandbag on the bench. He selected his graver from the roll, tested its edge against his thumbnail. A whisper of a catch. It was perfect. He sat down. He did not breathe deeply to prepare. He was already there, in that state of focus, carried from the calm of the lane, straight into the heart of the work. He positioned the point of the graver at the top of the first stroke of the numeral 6. The light was clear, sharp, perfect. He took one breath, let half of it out, and held the rest. And then he began to cut. The snick of the tool biting into the wood was the first true sound of the new day, crisp, decisive, and filled with the quiet joy of a promise being kept. The snick was not just a sound. It was an event. It was the crisp, clean division between potential and reality. The graver's point, a perfect confluence of hardened steel and diamond-sharp geometry, did not so much cut the wood as persuade it to open along a line of pure intention. A tiny pale curl, no larger than an eyelash, lifted from the surface of the boxwood and fell, forgotten, onto the sand. He did not pause to admire it. His hand, guided by decades of muscle memory that felt like thought itself, began to pull the tool along the ghostly pencil line of the numeral's first downstroke. The sound was a continuous, quiet crinkle, a serene and focused whisper. The V-shaped trench deepened, its walls smooth and burnished by the polished flank of the graver. He felt the subtle changing resistance of the wood's grain, the slight tug as he cut across it, the smoother glide as he cut with it. He adjusted the pressure of his fingers, a conversation conducted entirely through touch. His world contracted to the point of the tool, the advancing line, and the steady, slow exhalation of his breath. The rest of the shop, the morning light, the distant sounds of the waking lane, all dissolved into a pleasant, blurry periphery. There was only the line, its truth, its elegance. He reached the bottom of the stroke, where the line flared out into a delicate serif. Here, he did not turn the graver. He rotated the disc itself with his left hand, a smooth rolling motion on the leather sandbag, keeping the tool's angle constant as it carved the little foot of the serif. Ne, a tiny, definitive stop. He lifted the graver. The first stroke of the Vix was complete. A deep, clean groove in the honey-colored wood, its bottom a sharp, dark V, its edges crisp and without tear. He did not look at it as a whole. No, he saw only the next line. He repositioned the point for the parallel downstroke, breathed, held on to snick, crinkle, crinkle, crinkle. The twin trench was carved. The numeral versives now existed not as a suggestion, but as a fact. Two deep, parallel canyons in a miniature world. He moved to the V. This was more complex. The first diagonal downstroke. He angled the graver in his grip, adjusting the heel of his palm to guide the direction. The cut began. The sound changed slightly, a softer shush, as the tool sheared through the wood at an angle. He followed the pencil line with unwavering fidelity, his eye judging the convergence point where this stroke would meet the next. He stopped at the invisible vertex, the point sharper than any needle. Without lifting the graver completely, he pivoted his wrist, a motion as subtle as the tightening of a spider's thread. He began the upstroke. This was the most dangerous part. Cutting uphill against the grain risked a tear, a ragged edge. But his touch was so sure, the tool so sharp, that the wood yielded as if grateful to be shown its true form. The upstroke met the downstroke at the vertex, a meeting so perfect. It seemed the two lines had grown from a single seed. The horizontal crossbar was a simple relief after that, a short, confident crinkle crinkle. And the V was complete, a stark, elegant shape carved into the universe of the disc. He continued, numeral by numeral, around the circle. The 3 was a meditation on parallelism. But the 12 was a symphony of intersecting angles and verticals, a test of special harmony that he passed without a moment of doubt. His breathing was the only rhythm, a slow tide that ebbed and flowed with the end of one cut and the beginning of the next. In, hold, cut, out. In, hold, cut, out. The morning sun climbed, its beam strengthening, moving across the bench to illuminate his hands and the emerging masterpiece. The golden light caught the freshly cut grooves, making the dark V shadows within them seem infinitely deep. Pile of boxwood dust gathered in the spirals of the fallen shavings and in the fine lines of his knuckles. He did not stop. He did not waver. The focus required was not a strain, but a refuge. In this state, there was no past, no future, no puzzle watch, no carriage clock. There was only the present line, and the next, and the profound silence between the snicks. He engraved the final numeral, the I, a single confident stroke that closed the circle. He lifted the graver and set it down on the felt pad beside him. He let out the long, slow breath he felt he had been holding for the entire circuit. For the first time, he looked at the hole. The chapter ring lay on the sandbag, transformed. The pale graphite ghosts were gone, replaced by deep, definitive trenches of black shadow. The Roman numerals stood in a silent, majestic procession around the central void. They were no longer drawn. They were inscribed. They were part of the wood's very substance. They would hold ink. They would defy time. They would defy time. They were perfect. He picked up the disc, his fingers careful not to touch the engraved faces. He held it to the light, turning it slowly. Each numeral caught the sun, one after the other, springing into sharp relief. The serifs were delicate, yet strong. The spacing was harmonious. It was better than the pattern in the book. It had the life of the hand in it. Deep, quiet satisfaction settled in his chest, warm and solid. This was a good thing he had made. He placed the finished chapter ring back in its baize-lined drawer. It was not a component anymore. It was an artifact, complete in itself. It would wait there until it was needed, perhaps for the carriage clock, perhaps for another. Its destiny was no longer his concern. The creative fever of the morning was spent. He felt a pleasant emptiness, a clear and calm fatigue in his eyes and hands. He eyed the graver meticulously, wiping away every speck of boxwood resin, oiling its blade with a feather dipped in fine mineral oil. He put it away in its roll. He stood, stretched his back, and heard the soft pops of vertebrae adjusting. The shop, which had held its breath during his engraving, seemed to exhale with him. The sounds of the world filtered back in. The now familiar shush of the broom had ceased, replaced by the distant, cheerful call of a street vendor selling flowers. His gaze drifted to the holly box. The puzzle, the satisfaction of the finished chapter ring, had created a space, a clearing in his mind. He felt ready to listen to the watch again, to hear what it had to say after a night of considering its tiny adjustment. He did not sit. He opened the box and took out the watch. He wound it 3 clicks. He held it to his ear and gave it a shake. Tick. Eagle brave, solitary sound. Then nothing. He frowned, not in frustration, but in curiosity. Yesterday, it had run for a minute. Today, only a single tick. The adjustment had not improved it. It had changed it. The conversation had taken a new turn. He sat down now, putting on his loupe. He opened the case. In the magnified world, everything looked the same, but he knew it was not. He gently touched the balance wheel with the blunted tweezers, giving it the faintest nudge. It swung. Tick, dow, tee, tock, tick. And then it stuttered, but differently. The palette fork seemed to stick, not at the impulse, but at the lock. The banking pin he had adjusted was now perhaps too close. The fork was being caught, held for a fraction of a second too long, starving the balance wheel of its needed push. He leaned back, removing the loop. He had overcorrected. He had been too bold with his 1-degree turn. The watch was telling him, with its new, more stubborn silence, to be even more gentle, to think in fractions of degrees. This was the true work, not the bold creation of the chapter ring, but this infinitely patient dialogue with a flaw smaller than a thought. He would not touch it again today. He had received the message. The watch needed to sit with this new configuration, and he needed to think in even smaller increments. He closed the watch and returned it to its box. There was no disappointment, only respect. The mystery had deepened, and that was a kind of gift. He looked at the carriage clock on the shelf, then at the empty workbench. The morning's great task was done. The afternoon's delicate problem was set aside to mature. There was, it seemed, nothing pressing, and so he did something he rarely did in the middle of the day. He walked to the shelf and took down not a tool or a component, but a book, a heavy leather-bound volume on the history of pendulum design. He carried it to the old worn armchair in the corner, a chair used more for waiting than for reading. He sat down, the leather sighed beneath him. He opened the book, not to any particular page, and began to read, not to study, but to let his mind, still humming from the precision of engraving, drift on the slow, deep currents of theory and history. The words were a balm. The diagrams of forgotten clockmakers' solutions to problems of friction and error were like poetry. The sunbeam moved across the floor, climbed the leg of his chair, and warmed the page. The talk of the long case clock was a steady, comforting companion to the soft rustle of a page turning every great while. He read, and the shop settled around him into a state of pure, unproductive peace. There was no goal here, no outcome to achieve. There was only the gentle passing of light, the quiet company of knowledge, and the deep restorative joy of a mind and a space in perfect, idle harmony. For the first time that day, there was absolutely nothing to be done, and in that, there was everything. The light in the armchair grew warm, then hazy, as the sunbeam softened from a sharp blade of gold to a diffuse pool of honey. The words on the page before him had long ceased to be sentences, and had become a gentle blur, a landscape of gray type over which his eyes peacefully drifted without demand. The book was a prop, a permission slip for stillness. His breathing had slowed to match the long case clock's languid talk. A rhythm so deep it felt like the building's own pulse. A sense of completion, soft and round as the boxwood disc in its drawer, filled the room. The arc of the day was bending towards its gentle close. The rate of fire of the engraving was banked to embers. The probing curiosity about the watch's hesitation had been acknowledged and respectfully shelved. Even the passive act of reading had run its course, the mind now pleasantly empty, like a cleared workbench. He closed the book with a soft, solid thump that echoed in the quiet. The sound was a full stop. He sat for a moment longer, his hands resting on the worn leather cover, feeling the sun's residual warmth in the material. Then, with a sigh that was not tired, but content, he rose. He returned the book to its precise place on the shelf, aligning its spine flush with its neighbors. This was the beginning of the evening ritual, the slow, deliberate process of returning the shop to a state of perfect readiness for the night and for the unknown day to come. He started at the periphery. He dusted the shelves with a long-handled feather duster, the gull's wings whispering over the shoulders of silent clocks and boxes of parts. He did not move them. He simply acknowledged them, brushing away the day's thin offering of dust. He straightened a porcelain dial that was a quarter-inch out of line. He turned a wooden mallet so its handle faced the wall, a practice of neatness that served no purpose but order itself. He moved to the sink, cleaned and dried the single porcelain cup he used for tea, and placed it upside down on its shelf. He folded the towel neatly on its hook. Then he came to the heart of it, the workbench. He brushed the invisible accumulation of the day, the last fine ghosts of boxwood dust, a single shaving that had escaped the morning's sweep, into his palm and deposited it in the wastebasket. He smoothed the fresh white linen cloth that had replaced the used one. He went through the tray of tools, not using them, but touching them. He ensured every screwdriver was aligned, every brush bristled up, every pair of tweezers lying with their tips together. It was a tactile inventory, a reaffirmation of his relationship with each instrument. Lastly, he attended to the three silent protagonists of the day. He opened the shallow drawer. The chapter ring lay in its bed of green baize, the engraved numerals now holding deep shadows in the low, slanting light. He did not take it out. He simply looked at it, acknowledging its finished perfection. He closed the drawer. He lifted the holly box. He did not open it. He held its light weight, feeling the solid, secret presence of the watch within. He placed it back on its high shelf, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a companion in waiting, a conversation paused, not abandoned. Finally, he stood before the shelf with the carriage clock. He ran a single finger along the top of its rosewood case, a caress of pure appreciation. It was ready. It was whole. It needed nothing from him. Bellows. He stepped back. The shop was in order. Every object was in its place, resting in a state of potential. The only emotion was the pendulum of the long case clock. The only sound its peaceful, woody heartbeat. He went to the clock. He opened the door and checked the weights. They had descended only a little. He gave the pendulum a small, encouraging push with his finger, feeling the solid, weighty swing through the tip. Talk, it was a good sound. He walked to the coat stand and put on his own coat. The familiar weight settled on his shoulders. He buttoned it slowly, each button a deliberate act of transition. He did not look around. He did not need to. The image of the orderly, quiet space was within him, as much a part of him as his own breath. He went to the door. His hand rested on the cool iron of the latch. He looked out the window one last time. The light was the color of ripe apricots, long shadows stretching across the lane outside. The day was tired and beautiful in its tiredness. He lifted the latch. The door opened with its familiar, sighing creak. The cool evening-scented air, carrying the first hint of night-blooming jasmine from a window box down the lane, flowed in to greet him. He stepped over the threshold. He turned, his hand on the outside handle. He looked in. The shop was a cave of golden twilight, the workbench a clean altar, the tools silent soldiers. What? The talk followed him out, a faithful echo. Good night, he whispered, the words so soft they were merely a shape. His lips made in the quiet air. He pulled the door closed. The sound was a soft, final shoom of wood and peace. The iron key turned. Clack-a-ta. Inside, the shop was alone. The last horizontal beam of sun lit the floating dust in a final, dazzling display before it vanished, leaving the room in the soft, blue-gray embrace of twilight. The talk continued a lullaby for the tools, for the chapter ring in its drawer, for the stuttering heart in the holly box, for the polished carriage clock. The rhythms of care had been fulfilled. The silence that remained was not empty, but rich. Wait, it was the silence of a question not yet asked, a line not yet drawn, a wheel not yet turning. It was the fertile silence of what might come next, whenever next might be. And in that silence, deep and complete and waiting, there was a kind of answer to every question that had ever been asked within those walls. The answer was not in words, but in the patient, everlasting fact of the space itself, a sanctuary where time was not spent, but tended, not chased, but gently, lovingly observed. And so we leave him there, on the threshold between the quiet he has cultivated and the quiet of the world outside. The key has turned. The latch has settled. Inside, the shop holds its breath, a vessel filled to the brim with the day's gentle attentions. Tonight, we have wandered through a world where time is not a taskmaster, but a companion, where a single breath can hold the space between one tick and the next, where the most profound work is done not with force, but with presence. We have witnessed the transformation of a rough block of wood into a promise of hours, and a respectful, patient dialogue with a mystery smaller than a thought. This story, like the workbench at its end, is now clear. The tools of the narrative, the descriptions of light, the sounds of tools, the rhythms of breath, have been set down in their proper order. There are no loose ends, because in a space like this, there are no ends, only pauses. The chapter ring is finished, waiting for its clock. The watch is still, holding its secret. The carriage clock gleams, patient. All are at peace with their state of becoming. This is the true conclusion. Not that everything was finished, but that everything was cared for. That in the act of patient, focused attention, whether on crafting beauty, solving a riddle, or simply sitting in quiet company, we find a deep and lasting antidote to the noise of the world. The unhurried clockmaker does not fight time. He companions it. He listens to its heartbeat, and in doing so, reminds us that our own frantic rhythms are not mandatory. We, too, can choose to breathe, to notice the grain of wood, the path of dust in a sunbeam, the space between our own thoughts. So, as this final note of the story fades, let it leave behind not an ending, but an invitation to carry a fragment of this quiet shop with you into your own night, to notice where in your life you might turn a screw one deliberate quarter rotation, instead of forcing it, to find a single, simple thing you can observe with soft focus, without demand, to grant yourself permission to be a curator of your own peace, a tender of your own inner stillness. The shop is dark now. The last mote of dust has settled. The long case clock's pendulum swings in the dark. A metronome for dreams? Wherever you are, whatever weight you carried here tonight, you can set it down now, on the workbench of your mind. Smooth it out and leave it there. It will be safe. Nothing is required of you in this moment but to breathe and to rest. Thank you for spending this time in the quiet. Thank you for listening. May your night be as deep and as peaceful as the silence in the shop after the key has turned. May you wake feeling restored and a little more unhurried. Good night. Good night.